Walter Jenkins had lived in the same little house on the edge of Cedar Hollow for 63 years, ever since he'd brought his young bride home from the train station with nothing but 2 suitcases and a promise to build a good life. Now the suitcases were long gone, the promise had been kept, and his wife had been resting under the old oak in the churchyard for 12 winters. But Walter stayed. The house knew his footsteps. The porch swing creaked in time with his thoughts, and the garden still bloomed the way she'd taught him. Rows of tomatoes, beans climbing their poles, and marigolds planted along the fence to keep the bugs away. At 82, Walter moved slower than he used to. His knees ached when the rain came in, and some mornings it took him 3 tries to get out of bed without groaning. But he refused to call it old age. He called it living long enough to remember how things used to be. Every day, rain or shine, he'd shuffle out to the porch by 7, thermos of strong black coffee in hand, and watch the world wake up. Birds in the pines, squirrels chasing each other across the roof, the occasional pickup truck rumbling down the county road. This was his rhythm. Simple, quiet, enough. He didn't need much. A bowl of oatmeal, a chapter from whatever library book he'd checked out that week. Maybe a phone call from his daughter who lived 2 towns over. She worried about him living alone, of course. "Dad, you sure you don't want to move closer?" She'd ask every Sunday, and every Sunday he'd say the same thing. "This house holds your mother's laugh. I'm not leaving it behind." One Thursday in late September, the sky turned gray by mid-morning. Thick clouds rolled in fast, the kind that didn't warn you, they just opened up. Rain came down in sheets, drumming on the tin roof like it had something urgent to say. Walter was inside patching a hole in his fishing vest when he heard it. A soft, uneven thudding on the gravel path, not the steady crunch of a neighbor's boots. This was halting, uncertain, like someone trying not to fall. He peered through the rain-streaked window and saw him. A young man, drenched from head to toe, one hand gripping his ankle, the other braced against the fence post. His clothes were soaked through, his backpack sagging with water, and his face, pale, tired, lost. Walter didn't hesitate. He grabbed his biggest raincoat, the one with the hood that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and opened the door. "Son," he called over the downpour, "you look like you've walked through a river." The young man flinched, then turned, eyes wide with surprise and relief. I didn't mean to bother anyone," he stammered, voice rough. "I was hiking up near Black Ridge, took a wrong turn, and, well, my phone died. Then I twisted my ankle trying to cross that creek." He winced as he shifted his weight. "I saw your house and thought, maybe I could just sit under your porch for a minute." "Under the porch?" Walter chuckled, stepping aside. "You're coming inside before you catch your death. Come on now." He led the young man into the kitchen where the wood stove kept the room warm even on the dampest days. "Sit," Walter said, pointing to a chair with a faded floral cushion. Then he disappeared into the hall closet and came back with a thick towel and a pair of dry wool socks. "Here, dry off. I'll make us some tea." While the kettle whistled, Walter watched the stranger carefully wring water from his sleeves. He couldn't have been more than 25. There was dirt on his cheek, a scrape on his forearm, and a kind of quiet desperation in the way he kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting trouble to follow him. "Don't worry," Walter said gently, setting a steaming mug in front of him. "No one's chasing you here. Just rain." The young man let out a shaky breath and wrapped his hands around the mug. "Thank you," he said, voice softer now. "Really, I didn't know what I was going to do." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the rain on the roof and the occasional sigh from the old floorboards. Then the young man looked down at his swollen ankle. "I don't suppose you've got anything I could lean on?" "I can't walk far like this," Walter nodded slowly. He stood, walked to the corner of the living room and picked up his walking stick. It wasn't fancy, just a straight piece of hickory darkened by decades of use, with a smooth knob at the top carved by his own grandfather back in 1947. The wood held memories, walks to the post office, trips to the hardware store, slow strolls beside his wife in the cemetery every Sunday. It wasn't just a stick. It was a part of his story, but stories, Walter believed, were meant to be shared. He handed it to the young man. "Here, take it." The young man stared at it like it was made of gold. "Sir, I can't, this looks important." "It is," Walter said simply. "That's why I'm giving it to you. You need it more than I do today. But how will I get it back to you?" Walter waved a hand. Don't you worry about that. If you ever pass through Cedar Hollow again, you can bring it by. If not, well, just help someone else the way I helped you. That'll be payment enough." The young man's eyes glistened, not from the rain this time, but from something deeper. He stood carefully, testing his weight on the stick. It fit his height perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him. "I will," he said, voice thick. "I promise." Walter walked him to the edge of the driveway where the rain had finally eased to a drizzle. The young man turned one last time. "What's your name, sir?" "Walter." "Thank you, Walter." And then he was gone, limping down the road, the hickory stick tapping softly against the wet gravel. Walter watched until he disappeared around the bend. Then he went back inside, made himself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat on the porch swing. The rain had washed everything clean, the leaves, the road, even the air. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, the kind that comes not from grand gestures but from doing what's right without thinking twice. He didn't expect anything in return. Not thanks, not fame, not even the stick back. He'd given it because it was the human thing to do. And in his 82 years, he'd learned that sometimes the smallest kindnesses echo the loudest. Little did he know, that echo was already rolling down the mountain, gathering speed, gathering voices, and by tomorrow morning, it would bring the whole world to his doorstep. The young man didn't stop walking until he reached the edge of town, where the paved road gave way to gravel and then to dirt. His ankle throbbed with every step, but the hickory stick held firm, steady beneath his palm. It felt strange, like holding someone else's memory in his hands. The wood was warm, worn smooth in just the right places, as if it had been shaped by years of quiet walks and patient hands. He kept glancing back toward the ridge, half expecting to see the old man's porch light flicker in the distance. But the rain had swallowed everything behind him. He finally made it to a small roadside motel just off the highway, the kind with flickering neon and rooms that smelled faintly of mildew and coffee. The clerk barely looked up as he handed over his credit card, too busy watching a game on the tiny TV behind the counter. Once inside room 7, he dropped his soaked backpack, peeled off his wet clothes, and wrapped himself in the thin motel blanket. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding since he'd limped onto that porch. He wasn't just lost. He'd been searching. For months, he'd been traveling through small towns, back roads, and forgotten corners of the country, recording voices most people never heard. He worked for a public radio show that told stories about ordinary people doing quiet, extraordinary things. Farmers who fed hungry neighbors after floods, librarians who drove books to shut-ins, veterans who fixed bikes for kids. His job wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. And lately, it had started to feel like the world needed these stories more than ever. He'd come to the mountains hoping to find something real, something untouched by headlines or hashtags. He hadn't expected to twist his ankle. He certainly hadn't expected to meet a man like Walter. Now sitting on the edge of a lumpy bed with the hickory stick leaning against the nightstand, he pulled out his recorder. The battery was low, but he didn't care. He pressed record and began to speak, his voice low and raw like he was telling a secret to an old friend. "Today I met a man who gave me his walking stick," he said, "not because I asked, not because he knew me, just because I needed it. He didn't even ask my name until I was leaving. And when I tried to refuse it, he said, 'Just help someone else the way I helped you.' That's it. No fanfare, no expectation, just kindness, plain and simple." He paused, running his thumb over the carved knob of the stick. "This isn't just wood. It's trust. It's history. It's the kind of thing you pass down through generations, not hand to a stranger in the rain." But he did, and that wrecked me a little. He recorded for nearly 20 minutes, describing the smell of the kitchen, the way the old man's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the quiet dignity in his voice. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth, as gently as it had been given to him. Later that night, after icing his ankle and eating a sad microwave dinner, he edited the audio on his laptop. He added soft background music, just a few notes of acoustic guitar, and titled the piece "The Stick That Carried Kindness." He uploaded it to the show's website and shared it on their social pages with a short note. Sometimes the smallest act holds the biggest lesson. He didn't think much of it after that. He figured a few hundred listeners might hear it, maybe share it with a friend. That was usually how it went. He turned off the light, set the walking stick by the door like a guard, and fell asleep to the hum of the motel's ancient air conditioner. But while he slept, something unexpected happened. The story began to spread. First, a teacher in Ohio shared it with her students during morning circle. Then a truck driver played it over his CB radio, and his friends started passing it along. Someone posted a clip on a community forum. Listen to this. It'll remind you people are still good. By midnight, the audio had been shared thousands of times. By 3 a.m., it was trending on a major news site under the headline, "Stranger gives away family heirloom. What happens next will restore your faith." Comments poured in. I cried listening to this on my lunch break. We need more Walters in the world. This is why I still believe in humanity. Back in his motel room, the young man's phone buzzed nonstop, emails from producers, messages from strangers, interview requests. He ignored them all. He wasn't doing this for attention. He just wanted people to remember that goodness still existed, especially in places no one was looking. The next morning, he packed his things carefully. He placed the hickory stick in a padded case he'd brought for fragile field equipment. Before checking out, he wrote a note on motel stationery. "I'll return this. I promise." He left it on the counter with a generous tip for the night clerk, who finally looked up and gave him a nod. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The mountains faded behind him, but the weight of what had happened stayed with him. He hadn't just found a story. He'd been changed by it. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Hollow, Walter Jenkins was having his usual morning routine. Coffee, crossword puzzle, a quick check on his tomato plants. He had no idea that his quiet act had rippled across the country overnight. He didn't own a smartphone. He barely used the internet. His daughter had tried to teach him how to check email, but he'd said, "If it's important, they'll call or come by." So when his old landline rang just after 9, he answered with a cheerful, "Jenkins residence." It was the local radio station. "Mr. Jenkins," the voice said, "have you heard what's happening online?" Walter frowned. "Online? Son, I don't even know what you're talking about." They explained as best they could that someone had told a story about him, about the walking stick, and now people all over the country were talking about his kindness. Walter just chuckled. "Well, that's mighty strange. I didn't do anything special." "But you did," the voice insisted. "You reminded people what decency looks like." Walter didn't know what to say to that. He thanked them politely and hung up, shaking his head. People got too much time on their hands, he muttered to the cat curled up on the windowsill. He went back to his crossword, but a part of him felt uneasy. He'd never liked being the center of attention. His wife used to tease him, "You'd rather fix a neighbor's fence at midnight than accept a thank you card in daylight." And it was true. He believed kindness should be like breathing, natural, necessary, and done without fanfare. Now strangers knew his name. Strangers were calling him a hero, and he hadn't even left his porch. He looked out the window toward the road. The sky was clear. Birds were singing. Everything seemed normal. But something had shifted. He could feel it in the air, like the quiet before a storm. He didn't know it yet, but by noon his driveway would be full of cars. People would be coming, not to interview him, not to take his photo, but simply to meet the man who gave away his walking stick. They'd bring pies, handmade blankets, letters from their kids. They'd want to shake his hand, look him in the eye, and say thank you. And Walter, who had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight, would have to decide, how do you stay kind when the whole world is watching? But that was for later. For now, he finished his coffee, filled the bird feeder, and whispered to the wind, "Hope that young man's ankle's feeling better." Had no idea that the young man was already planning his return and that the story was far from over. Walter Jenkins woke up the next morning just like any other before sunrise, with a soft ache in his knees and the familiar creak of the old bed frame. He shuffled to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stepped onto the porch with his thermos, expecting the usual quiet, mist rising off the fields, the distant lowing of cattle, maybe a woodpecker tapping at the old maple. But something was different. Even before he took his first sip of coffee, he heard it, the low rumble of an engine. Not the usual pickup from down the road. This one slowed as it neared his driveway. Then another followed. And another. At first, Walter thought maybe there'd been an accident up on the ridge and folks were detouring through his property. But then a silver sedan pulled right up to his mailbox and stopped. A woman got out, mid-50s, wearing a bright yellow raincoat even though the sun was shining, and walked toward the porch with a small cloth bag in her hands. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. "Mr. Jenkins," she called out, voice gentle. Walter set his thermos down. "That's me. I heard your story," she said, stepping closer. "On the radio. About the walking stick." She held out the bag. "I baked you some banana bread. My mama's recipe. I just wanted to thank you." Walter blinked. "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding us that people still look out for each other." Her eyes shimmered a little. "My son's been struggling lately. Feels like the world's gone cold. I played your story for him last night." He smiled for the first time in weeks. Walter didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to this. He took the bread, still warm, and mumbled, "Well, that's real kind of you." Before he could invite her in for coffee, another car pulled up, a red pickup this time. A man in a flannel shirt stepped out, holding a hand-knit scarf. "Heard you gave away your walking stick," he said. "Figured you might need something to keep warm this winter." Then came a young couple with a jar of honey from their beehives, an older gentleman carrying a hand-carved birdhouse, a teenager with a letter she'd written in neat cursive, "You made me believe in good people again." By 10 o'clock, there were 8 cars parked along the roadside. By 11, it was 15. By noon, the gravel driveway was full and vehicles were lining both sides of the county road for nearly half a mile. People weren't shouting or pushing. They weren't taking selfies or live streaming. They just stood quietly, many with tears in their eyes, waiting for a chance to say thank you, to hand over a small gift, to shake Walter's hand. He stayed on the porch, overwhelmed but polite. He accepted every loaf of bread, every jar of jam, every handmade card. He listened as people told him about their own struggles, loneliness, loss, fear that kindness was disappearing. And each time he'd nod and say something simple like, "We all need a little help sometimes," or "Just pass it on when you can." A local news van arrived around 1, but Walter waved them off. "I'm not giving interviews," he said firmly. "This isn't about me." The reporter respected his wishes and just filmed from the road. Quiet shots of people coming and going, of gifts piling up on the porch swing. His daughter called twice that morning, frantic. "Dad, are you okay?" "There are cars everywhere. Someone posted your address online." "I'm fine," Walter assured her. "They're just good people." "But what if someone gets hurt? What if it gets out of hand?" "It won't," he said. "They're not here for trouble. They're here because they're hurting, and they're looking for hope," and that was the truth. These weren't tourists or thrill seekers. They were nurses who'd worked double shifts, veterans who'd lost friends, parents who worried about their kids growing up in a harsh world. They'd heard a 5-minute story about an old man who gave away something precious without asking for anything back, and it had cracked something open in them. One woman, standing near the fence with a small child on her hip, whispered to Walter, "I drove 6 hours last night. I didn't even tell my husband where I was going. I just needed to see you, to know you're real." Walter looked at her, tired eyes, windblown hair, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long, and he reached out and gently touched her arm. "I'm real," he said softly, "and so are you. Don't forget that." She started to cry. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd didn't grow rowdy. If anything, it grew quieter, more reverent. People began helping each other, offering rides to those whose cars had overheated, sharing water, watching each other's kids. Someone set up a folding table and started organizing the gifts so Walter wouldn't be overwhelmed. Another brought a cooler of lemonade and passed cups around. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a gathering. Walter, who'd spent most of his life avoiding attention, found himself strangely moved. Not by the praise, but by the shared humanity in front of him. These strangers weren't here to worship him. They were here because they recognized something in his story that they'd almost forgotten in themselves. The power of simple, unguarded kindness. When the sun began to dip behind the hills, most of the cars started to leave. They didn't honk or wave dramatically. They just got in their vehicles, gave a quiet nod toward the porch, and drove off as if they'd visited a sacred place and didn't want to disturb its peace. By dusk, the road was nearly empty again. The porch was covered in gifts, baskets, blankets, books, even a hand-stitched quilt with a note that read, "For the man who gave without keeping score." Walter sat in his rocker, too tired to move everything inside. He sipped cold coffee and watched fireflies blink in the garden. His heart felt full but also heavy. He hadn't asked for any of this. He'd only done what felt right in the moment, and yet, seeing all those faces, hearing those stories, it reminded him that loneliness wasn't just his burden. It belonged to everyone. And maybe, just maybe, a walking stick could be more than wood. Maybe it could be a bridge. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but as the stars came out one by one, he whispered into the dark, "Hope that young man knows what he started." And somewhere miles away, the young man was already packing his bag again, this time not to leave but to return. At first, the attention felt like a warm blanket, unexpected but comforting. People were kind, respectful, and full of gratitude. Walter told himself it would pass in a day or two. Folks would go back to their lives, and he'd return to his quiet mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles. But the days didn't quiet down. If anything, they got louder. By the third morning, cars were arriving before sunrise. Some people camped overnight in their vehicles just to be first in line. A few brought cameras, not just for memories, but for social media posts. "Standing where kindness lives," one woman announced into her phone, spinning slowly in front of Walter's porch. He didn't say anything, but he closed the curtains a little tighter that day. Then came the reporters who wouldn't take no for an answer. They parked just outside his property line, shouting questions through megaphones. "Mr. Jenkins, how does it feel to be a national hero? Are you going to write a book? Will you run for office?" He stopped answering the door altogether. His daughter came by with groceries and stayed on the porch for an hour, just to keep him company, and to make sure no one trespassed. The gifts kept coming too. Boxes arrived by mail. Strangers left care packages on his doorstep when he wasn't looking. One morning he found a brand new walking stick wrapped in burlap with a note, "So you don't have to go without." It was beautifully made, but it didn't feel like his. His stick, the old hickory one, had history in its grain. This one was just wood. Worse than the noise was the feeling of being watched. Every time he stepped outside to check his tomatoes or feed the stray cat that liked his porch, he'd catch someone filming from down the road. Once, a drone buzzed overhead, and he had to wave his arms like a scarecrow until it flew away. He started doing his chores at night under the cover of dark just to have a moment alone. His routine, the one that had kept him steady since his wife passed, was gone. No more peaceful coffee on the porch. No more slow walks to the mailbox. Even his garden felt different, like it was no longer his private sanctuary but a stage. One afternoon, while sorting through yet another pile of letters, he came across a printed-out comment someone had slipped into an envelope. "This is all fake. He's just using this for attention." Old people love the spotlight. His hands shook as he read it. He'd never wanted the spotlight. He'd only wanted to help a young man in the rain. He called his daughter that evening, voice quieter than usual. "I think I made a mistake," he said. "What do you mean, Dad?" "Giving that stick away. I thought it was just between me and him. Now it's turned into a circus, and I don't even know if that boy meant for this to happen." "He didn't," she said firmly. "I've been reading what he posted. He never shared your address. Someone else dug it up and spread it online. He's actually been asking people to stop coming." Walter sighed. "Then why won't they listen?" "Because they're hungry," she said gently. "Hungry for something real. And you gave them a taste of it." But hunger, Walter was learning, could turn into something desperate, something messy. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. A group of teenagers showed up, not with gifts, but with a boombox and a banner that read, "Walter for President." They started playing loud music and dancing near his fence, laughing and taking videos. One of them climbed onto his garden gate for a photo. That was too much. Walter stepped onto the porch, not with anger, but with a sadness so deep it made his chest ache. "Please," he said, voice steady but tired. "This is my home, not a show." They froze. The music stopped. One of them mumbled an apology and quickly took down the banner. They left without another word. After that, Walter didn't go outside for 2 whole days. He kept the blinds shut, the phone off the hook, and the porch light dark. His daughter brought meals and sat with him in silence. She didn't try to fix it. She just stayed. Inside, Walter wrestled with guilt. Had he done the wrong thing? Should he have kept the stick? Should he have said no to the stranger? But then he remembered the young man's face. The relief, the gratitude, the way his shoulders had relaxed when he realized he wasn't alone. That moment had been real, pure, and that hadn't changed no matter what happened after. The problem wasn't the kindness. The problem was what the world did with it once it got out. Online, the conversation had shifted. Some people still called him a hero, but others accused the young man of exploiting an old man for clicks. He used Walter's story to go viral, one post read. That's not journalism, that's manipulation. Another said, real kindness doesn't need an audience. Walter hated that his simple act had become a debate. Kindness wasn't supposed to be complicated. It wasn't supposed to be argued about on screens by people who'd never met him or walked his road. One evening, as he sat in his armchair listening to the wind in the trees, he thought about his wife. She'd always said, do good quietly and let the good speak for itself. He'd tried to live by that, but now the good had been shouted so loudly it had lost its voice. He missed the rain. He missed the quiet. He missed the feeling that his life was his own. Still, even in the midst of all this chaos, small moments of grace slipped through. A neighbor left firewood at his back gate with a note. No cameras, just wood. The local post office started holding his mail inside so strangers couldn't snoop, and one morning he found a single marigold tied to his doorknob, the same kind he grew in his garden, with a slip of paper that read, "Thank you for reminding us how to be human." Those little things kept him going. He began to understand that he couldn't control what others did with his story, but he could decide how he responded. He wouldn't become bitter. He wouldn't shut his heart. But he also wouldn't pretend this was easy. He was just a man who'd lent a walking stick, not a symbol, not a saint, just a man. And maybe, he thought, that was enough. He didn't know the young man was already on his way back, not with cameras or recorders, but with a heavy heart and a promise to make things right. All Walter knew was that the world had gotten too loud, and he was waiting for the quiet to return. But quiet, he was learning, doesn't always come from silence. Sometimes it comes from choosing peace even in the middle of the storm. The evening air was cool and sweet with the smell of damp earth and late-blooming honeysuckle when the familiar tap, tap, tap of a walking stick sounded on the gravel path. Walter was sitting on the porch wrapped in his wife's old quilt, watching the fireflies blink over the garden. He didn't look up right away. He'd learned to be cautious with visitors, but something in the rhythm of those steps felt different, slower, softer, apologetic, almost, then a voice quiet and familiar. "Mr. Jenkins?" Walter turned. There he was, the young man from the rain, standing at the edge of the porch holding a small wooden box. His clothes were clean this time, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes carried a weight Walter hadn't seen before. Not exhaustion, not excitement, regret. Walter didn't say anything at first. He just studied him, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, the way he kept glancing at the ground like he wasn't sure he was welcome. After a long moment, Walter nodded toward the empty rocker beside him. "You gonna stand out there all night, or you gonna sit?" The young man let out a breath he'd clearly been holding and stepped up onto the porch. He set the box gently on the arm of Walter's chair. "I brought it back," he said. "Your stick." Walter opened the box. There it was, the old hickory walking stick polished to a soft gleam, the knob smoothed even more by careful hands. A new brass tip had been fitted to the bottom, sturdy and bright. It looked cared for, honored. "I'm sorry," the young man said before Walter could speak. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I just told the truth about what you did, about how it made me feel. I didn't share your address. I didn't ask people to come. But once it got out, I couldn't stop it." He swallowed hard. "I saw the videos. I read the comments. Some people turned your kindness into a performance, and that's on me." Walter ran his thumb over the wood. It felt like coming home. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. "You told a story. Stories travel. Sometimes they grow legs and run off in directions you didn't plan. But I should have protected you," the young man insisted. "You trusted me with something precious, and I let the world turn it into noise." Walter looked at him then, not with disappointment, but with the kind of understanding that only comes from living a long time. "Son," he said gently, "kindness isn't fragile. It doesn't break just because people misunderstand it. What you did, sharing that moment, it reminded folks that goodness still walks among us. Even if they got a little carried away, the heart of it was true. The young man's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. "I started something I couldn't finish," he said, "so I came back to try." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter and a brochure for a small community fund, the Cedar Hollow Neighbor Care Fund, set up in Walter's name. "It's not much yet," he explained, "but it'll help local folks with groceries, medicine, heating bills, things people don't like to ask for. No cameras, no stories, just quiet help the way you taught me." Walter read the letter slowly. It was simple, honest, no grand promises, just a commitment to keep passing on the kind of help he'd given that rainy afternoon. He folded the paper and placed it carefully on the table beside his coffee mug. "You didn't have to do this, I know," the young man said, "but I wanted to." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The tension that had lived in Walter's chest for days began to loosen. This wasn't a performance. This was just two people sitting in the dark trying to do right by each other. The next morning, something new began. Walter didn't reopen his door to crowds. He didn't give interviews or post anything online, but he did something quieter and maybe more powerful. He invited his neighbors over for coffee on Sunday morning. Just a few at first, folks he'd known for decades, plus a couple of newcomers who'd moved to the edge of town. He served the banana bread people had left him, poured strong coffee into mismatched mugs, and simply said, "Let's talk." No speeches. No cameras. Just conversation. Someone mentioned their roof was leaking. Another said their car needed repairs, but they couldn't afford the shop. A young mother admitted she was running low on formula. Without fanfare, Walter pulled out a notebook and started writing things down. By noon, 3 neighbors had volunteered to fix the roof. 2 others offered rides to the auto shop. And the woman who'd knitted the scarf? She knew someone at the clinic who could help with baby supplies. That Sunday became a habit. Every week, people gathered on Walter's porch, not to see a hero, but to be part of a community. They brought what they could, tools, time, advice, or just a listening ear. The gifts that had piled up during the chaos? Walter quietly passed them along, to the family whose barn burned down, to the elderly couple who couldn't afford their medicine, to the high school kid saving for college. The walking stick sat by the door again, but now it wasn't just for walking. It was a reminder. Help is meant to be shared. The cars stopped coming after a while. The news vans disappeared. The internet moved on to the next story. But in Cedar Hollow, something had changed. Not because of fame, but because of connection. The young man visited once more a few months later. This time he didn't bring a recorder. He brought a bag of seeds, marigolds just like the ones in Walter's garden, and helped plant them along the fence line. They worked in comfortable silence, hands in the dirt, the sun warm on their backs. Before he left, he handed Walter a small framed photo. It showed the 2 of them on the porch that first evening, taken by a neighbor who'd been passing by. On the back, in neat handwriting, was a quote someone had sent him after hearing the story. "In a world of strangers, be someone's walking stick." Walter hung it on the wall beside his wife's picture, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Years later, long after Walter was gone, people in Cedar Hollow still gathered on Sunday mornings. They called it kindness coffee. Newcomers were welcomed with a warm mug and a simple question. What do you need? And what can you give? No one made documentaries about it. No one went viral. But the kindness kept moving, quiet, steady, and strong, just like an old hickory stick tapping softly on the road, helping someone take one more step forward. And that, Walter would have said with a quiet smile, was more than enough. The years rolled on like seasons in Cedar Hollow, quiet, steady, marked more by the turning of leaves than by headlines. Walter's porch still creaked in the same places. The marigolds still bloomed along the fence every summer, tended now by a rotating group of neighbors who'd taken turns watering them long after Walter was gone. And every Sunday morning, without fail, the chairs came out, the coffee pot brewed, and folks gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. No one called it Walter's legacy. They didn't need to. It lived in the way Mrs. Callahan brought soup to the young couple whose baby was sick. It lived in the teenager who fixed Mr. Ellis's porch steps after school, refusing payment but accepting a slice of peach pie. It lived in the quiet understanding that if you needed help, you didn't have to ask twice, and if you could give, you gave without waiting to be thanked. The walking stick? It never left the house. After Walter passed, his daughter placed it by the front door, not as a museum piece, but as a quiet symbol. Anyone who needed a little steadiness on the walk home could borrow it, and every time someone did, they'd return it with a small note tucked in the brass tip's groove. Made it home. Thank you. The young man who'd started it all didn't become famous. He kept making radio stories, but he changed how he told them. No addresses, no names unless given freely. He focused on the feeling, not the fanfare. And every year, without fail, he'd drive back to Cedar Hollow on the anniversary of that rainy day. He never came to be seen. He came to sit on the porch swing, drink bad coffee, and listen. One autumn morning, about 10 years after that first visit, he arrived to find a small group of children helping an older woman plant bulbs near the garden gate. They looked up when he stepped out of his car, not with suspicion, but with the easy curiosity of kids who'd grown up knowing kindness wasn't rare, it was routine. "You're the storyteller," one boy said, brushing dirt from his knees. "I suppose I am," the young man, now not so young anymore, replied with a smile. "Grandma says you're the reason we have kindness coffee." He shook his head. "No, son. Your grandma and folks like her are the reason. I just passed along what I saw." The boy nodded like that made perfect sense. Then he held out a trowel. "Want to help? We're planting crocuses. They bloom first thing in spring." Like hope, he took the trowel, and for the next hour, he dug in the cool earth alongside them, saying little, feeling everything. Later, over coffee on the porch, the woman, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with Walter's same quiet strength, handed him a small wooden box. "Found this in the attic," she said. "Thought you should have it." Inside was a second walking stick. Not hickory, but ash, newer but carved with the same care. On the knob, someone had etched 2 words. "Pass it on." He ran his fingers over the letters. "Did Walter make this?" "No," she said. "My boy did. He was 10 when he heard your story on the radio. Said he wanted to make something that helped people walk tall." She paused, looking out at the garden. "He's a carpenter now. Builds ramps for folks who can't climb stairs. Says it all started with a stick and a stranger." The young man closed the box gently. He didn't cry, but his throat tightened the way it always did when goodness showed up wearing ordinary clothes. That evening, as he drove away, he didn't turn on the radio. He just rolled down the window and let the mountain air fill the car. In the rearview mirror, the lights of Cedar Hollow glowed softly against the darkening hills. Not bright like a city, but warm like embers kept alive by many hands. Back in his studio weeks later, he recorded a new piece. Not about fame, not about going viral, just about a town where people still show up for each other, one small act at a time. He called it "The Stick That Never Stopped Walking." And at the very end, instead of music, he played the sound of gravel under slow, steady footsteps and a screen door closing softly behind them. He never posted it online. He sent it only to a few public radio stations with a note, "Play it if it feels true. If not, burn it." Most stations played it. Listeners wrote in, not to find the town, but to start something like it in their own. And somewhere, in 100 different places, someone lent a hand, shared a meal, or offered their walking stick, not for likes or views, but because they remembered. Kindness isn't meant to be kept. It's meant to be passed along, worn smooth by use and trusted to find its way home. In the end, that rainy afternoon on a quiet porch hadn't just changed one life. It had planted a seed. And seeds, when tended with care, don't just grow, they multiply. Walter never knew how far the ripples went. But maybe that was the point. Real kindness doesn't watch itself in the mirror. It just keeps walking, one step at a time, trusting someone else will carry it forward when the path gets steep. And in Cedar Hollow, and in countless other places, quiet and unseen, the walking never really